It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative peer and former Cabinet Minister Nicky Morgan, the Shadow International Development Secretary Preet Gill, Daily Mirror political correspondent Alita Adu, and the Spectator's economics editor Kate Andrews. Today, tens of thousands of people open their homes to those fleeing war.
I'm just had it up to here with people trying to suggest that this country is not generous. So can we just chuck it when it comes to the partisan nonsense and get on with delivery?
But will the public's generosity to Ukrainian refugees last the course?
All of this is eating the poorest, the hardest, and planting the seeds for political instability and unrest around the globe.
Should the UK be increasing its aid budget rather than cutting it? Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has her UK passport returned. Could she be home with her family soon? And what is exempt housing? And is it failing the most vulnerable?
It's turning people who haven't had drug habits into people with them.
Now, I want to start with a conversation about pay because we've had new figures out this morning from the Office for National Statistics which show wages are failing to keep pace with the rising cost of living. Those figures show that between November and January, wages did rise, but when you take inflation into account, regular pay showed a 1% fall. And there is, of course, a very active conversation about wages given the rise in prices. Let's take a look at this headline in the Daily Mail. It says Boris will take £2,200 pay rise for MPs next month, despite previously urging restraint in the public sector amid soaring inflation. Now, this is because the independent body that sets MPs' pay has recommended a pay rise, taking it up to some £84,000 a year from next month. Nicky, do you think it's fair that MPs should get a pay rise right now?
Well, I think lots of people are going to be asking for pay rises. An MP's pay is set by an independent body, and I think that's quite right. So actually, MPs don't get the option of saying no to it. Of course, it's then up to the individual MP what they do with that pay rise. But all this feeds into the conversation that the Governor of the Bank of England was trying to start in the last month or so, which is about if people carry on, obviously, asking for higher wages, which is totally understandable given the pressure on the cost of living, then of course that contributes to ever higher inflation, which then of course makes the cost of living and our energy bills and everything else higher. So we are in quite uncharted territories for our economy that many people will not have seen for quite a long time.
I mean, Preet, Nicky's made the point, this is set by an independent body, but some of your colleagues, Richard Bergen, for example, suggested they'll give the extra to local charities or food banks. What are you going to do?
Well, look, I know it's difficult, and as Nicky said, it's set by an independent body, and that's absolutely right. MPs are not calling for this rise. My constituents, when I'm talking to them, are telling me about the real pinch that they're feeling for the cost of living. And, of course, what we've got to see is what is the government actually doing to help and support not just my constituents, but everybody in the country. And I think Labour's proposal of saving 9 million families for £600 and a further £200 to everyone else, especially when we're going to see national insurance increase, especially when council tax is going up. We know inflation's been going up before Ukraine. Cost of food is going up, and that's going to be even much worse now. So what do we need? We need the government to really understand how people are feeling on the ground. What is it that they need for the government to do? And actually, we need to see much better action from the government.
I mean, Preet's talking about inflation there, Alita. This pay rise for MPs is still below the rate of inflation. So do you think it's justified and right?
I think we need to remember that although it is automatic, we've heard of some MPs saying that they are donating their pay rise to, food banks or charitable, causes. And I think the Prime Minister and the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, should be encouraging their MPs to do the same thing. It's not good enough to hear our Prime Minister saying, oh, it's automatic and, I don't know what to do about it, so I'm just washing my hands and I'll take the extra money. I think especially at a time like this, April, we're seeing inflation, cost of living, energy bills are soaring. And that was even before, Russia invaded Ukraine, and now things are spiralling out of control. So I think, MPs should try and show some restraint and try and donate their pay to good causes.
I mean, Kate, MP's pay has actually been frozen through the coronavirus pandemic, but this increase would put it up to £84,144 a year, which to a lot of people struggling will sound like a lot of money.
Sure, 3 times the average salary in the UK, and it may be set by an independent body, but we have to ask ourselves how that system has allowed for this pay raise to come in, with all these points that have been made around the table about how difficult most people are finding it out there, noticing that real strain on their finances and this cost of living crisis that's only set to get worse. And I also might add in, is this really performance pay? The tax burden is going to be at its highest level in 71 years. Taxes are going up for people in April as MPs get this pay raise. If that is what MPs have overseen, the highest tax burden in 71 years, people are going to question why they're getting this extra cash and where it's coming from. The answer is, of course, the taxpayer.
OK. Well, I just want to talk now a bit about breaking news that we've had this morning, and this is to do with the British national Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who has, of course, been detained in Iran for the past 6 years. Her husband, Richard, has been actively campaigning for her release. Take a look at this tweet from her local MP, Tulip Siddiq. She says, "I'm very pleased to say that Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has been given her British passport back. She's still at her family home in Tehran. I also understand there's a British negotiating team in Tehran right now. I'll keep posting updates as I get them." So potentially very significant news there, and we can talk to our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams. Paul, just tell us, what more do we know about the situation now with Nazanin?
That's pretty much it, to be honest. The tweet from Tulip Siddiq, really the first indication, perhaps, that Nazanin might be on the verge of being released. I think we all need to be incredibly careful here. This has been a long and painful story, and there have been many false dawns. And there's no real way right now of knowing whether or not this will be another of those. But there is one other little piece of the puzzle which also emerged this morning, and that is a report from a well-respected Iranian journalist here in the UK who says that a £400 million debt owed by the British government to Iran following the cancellation of part of a military deal with Iran back in 1979 has now been paid. Now, the British government has always argued that this military debt had nothing to do with the fate of Nazanin and other dual nationals held in Iran. But certainly Iranian officials have made that link in the past. And if that debt has now been paid, then that does possibly indicate that the thing that was holding this all up has now been unlocked.
OK, Paul, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on the latest with it. And Nikki, it seems like potentially some cause for optimism, although we have been here before when it comes to Nazanin.
As Paul said, there have been false dawns. I mean, it would be amazing if she were able to return home to the UK to her family. I think her daughter obviously came home a little while ago to start school. Her husband Richard has been amazing in his campaigning. We just don't know yet what the circumstances are. There, of course, may be broader issues. There are lots of things going on in the world as well. We just don't know what the discussions are between the Foreign Office, between Iran and between other countries. So I think we do have to wait and see, and just hope and pray that this is the good news we've been seeking.
Preach.
I think this is a case that's really resonated with the British public. I think Richard's campaign has really touched so many people's lives, really. And I think we have got to be cautious. We've been in this place before where, our hopes have been raised and we think she's going to be released. I think it's really important we get clarity in terms of the debt. Of course, it's been widely reported that it has been as a result of not paying that debt. Of course, the government has denied that. So I think we'll wait and watch. This is a moving story at the moment. I think it's welcome that she has her British passport. Of course, people want to see her return back home safely with her daughter as well.
OK, as you say, we will wait and watch, of course, and hope for Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. Let's move now to the situation in Ukraine. And as the assault on the capital, Kiev, intensifies, so does the focus on the humanitarian cost of this war. We know that countries in the West, including the UK, have pledged hundreds of millions of pounds to the humanitarian effort in the countries that are surrounding Ukraine to support those who are fleeing, but also the impact on the wider region. Preet, you've been to Poland recently. What is the situation on the ground, and is the aid that's been pledged getting through to where it needs to be?
So I'm due to go now next week, but absolutely, look, I mean, the government's pledged 220 million. I asked the government to really be clear how much of that is actually for neighbouring countries and how much of that is within Ukraine, because, of course, we've seen how many people have fled Ukraine now, and that puts a lot of pressure on neighbouring countries. They've been very, very welcoming. Unfortunately, the government just hasn't given us an indication. And, of course, we've seen the budget cut, actually, from 0.7 to 0.5. Ukraine is not the only conflict we're dealing with. I mean, we've still got the ramifications of Afghanistan, we've got Yemen, we've got Syria, and, you know, all of these conflict situations require us to keep an eye on what is actually happening. If you think about the Sahel, if we, don't focus on the importance of development and aid getting there and finding a resolution to conflict, we're going to end up seeing situations like Ukraine happening in other parts. And I think this is so important. This idea that the government talked about the South Pacific tilt didn't actually make sense because, of course, you're ignoring what's happening on our doorstep. And I think the British public have really understood from Ukraine being so near actually what the impact of war is, the fact that people are being displaced, the fact that people need homes, they need shelter, they need some kind of certainty. And I think we've got to build on that public solidarity that we have seen from the British public, who absolutely do not support the aid cuts. I think it's an insult to them to see, that this is essentially being done in their name. It absolutely isn't. We've seen it during COVID, the pandemic. We've got to make sure that we are supporting neighbouring countries. We're doing enough to make sure that people are able to come to the United Kingdom. But, of course, at the moment, what we have is a government that makes a lot of announcements with very little detail.
Nikki, do you think it's time to reconsider that 0.7 to 0.5 cut in the aid budget?
Well, I would like to see the 0.7% restored, and I think the Chancellor has made it very clear that that's what he would like to see as well. As I say, we've got the spring statement coming up next week from the Chancellor. We are in very uncharted economic territory now. But I think what Preet has just said, and I fully appreciate, and there are always need for more details. This is a very fluid situation. The question is, where is the money most going to help? But the government has, when the money is needed, when the support is needed, it can be found. And as we're seeing, people in this country, £150 million so far given to the Disasters Emergency Committee from the public. Yes, some government matching, but I mean that just shows the generosity of the public.
But do you think that is being matched by the government? You mentioned the spring statement. Would you like that aid cut to be revised at the spring statement?
What I would like to see is perhaps a definite statement. If it's not going to be, revised or added back in there, actually, what is the path to getting back to 0.7%? And I think there's always going to be a demand to keep up to date with aid spending. So to think where in the world is the need greatest. We saw just after the 2010 election, for example, there was a review of aid that had gone to Russia and China and India. Rightly, those countries didn't need that level of aid or that type of aid. So you have to keep it under review all the time. But you have to be flexible, as I think our international development teams are, to respond very quickly to emergencies around the world.
I mean, Kate, of course, both Nikki and Preet have mentioned the fact that the fallout from Ukraine is going to be felt much more widely. And we heard from the UN Secretary-General yesterday. He talked about a sword of Damocles hanging over the global economy, the impact on supply, on food, on prices more broadly, which could affect some really developing countries. Do you think that that aid budget cut should be revised?
I think we need to decide what we want to target, who we want to target, how much aid we think is desperately needed in Ukraine at the moment, and also in Poland and along the border where they're taking in the refugees. Then we need to look at who we think, as you say, might be impacted in other parts of the world due to the cost of wheat going up, for example. And then we need to give to that. It might be more generous than what 0.7% would get you. I would expect to see something rather generous in the spring statement. I would be surprised if we didn't. But I think that target in and of itself distracts us from the wider point that we actually want to decide how this aid is being used, make sure that it's being used wisely. I think, unfortunately, when you pledge yourself to a specific target, you end up spending money oftentimes on things that you don't need or don't want. As you say, giving money to Russia, to China. I think there was a study carried out for millions and millions of pounds based on how much salt was in Chinese food. It was absolutely ridiculous, frankly, given what that money should actually be going towards. So let's decide how much we want to. Let's be generous towards Ukraine. Let's decide how much humanitarian support we want to give, and then let's pledge that money. It might be more than 0.7%. But let's decide what that is, not base it on the percentages.
Just to pick up on that point, I mean, what I would say is that the money that was spent by the international development, of course, during the pandemic, the government took over that department. Actually, taxpayers got value for their money. They spent that money. Aid effectiveness focused on poverty, and of course now inequalities are going to be exacerbated around the world. Women and girls are disproportionately impacted, and I suppose the government's got to make clear what is its priority in terms of the integrated review. There was a lot missing there. We're going to have to look, given Ukraine position and situation, we're going to have a look at actually where are those countries that we need to focus on and make sure aid is getting to those places. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that the last Conservative government was giving money to China, it is not correct, but that is money that is being spent by other government departments because, of course, 30% of ODA money is spent by other government departments. But the money that was spent by DFID was absolutely, the taxpayer was getting value for their money.
It is worth saying that Robert Halfon-Alita was on the programme yesterday, a Conservative MP, of course, and he said that the cut in the aid budget has actually freed up some £4 billion for the government to spend on other domestic needs to tackle the cost of living crisis, for example. Is that an argument?
That's definitely an argument. But, I mean, if I may just sidestep back to the refugee scheme that we've seen sort of unfold over the last, 20 days, it's just been utterly shambolic. And I was almost laughing at Michael Gove in the Commons yesterday when he was almost losing his rag and saying, I'm tired of hearing people say that British public are not generous. And this entire scheme now stands on the generosity of people. People are struggling. There is a cost of living crisis. People are now struggling to decide whether to clothe their children, whether to get their children's school uniform, whether to skip a meal, whether to pay their rent. And now their almost generosity is being exploited, and obviously they would love to help, but they can't because the government are not doing enough to support them. So I think Rishi Sunak really needs to use this spring statement coming up to try his best to either borrow more or just create some leeway to maybe even scrap the national insurance hikes to help people.
We're going to come back to refugees in a moment and talk a little bit more about it, but I just want to get your thought, Preet, on this idea from Robert Halfon that actually cutting the aid budget frees up money for other needs.
I think Robert Halfon just doesn't understand the importance of development and actually, as our soft power, the fact that the government was going to cut BBC World Service, the British Council, these are institutions that give us our world-renowned reputation. Once you decimate them, it's very difficult to re-establish those back. And this merger just hasn't worked. I mean, the very fact that we've had a story saying that the government is now going to have to get rid of the procured PPE at a cost of, what, £8 billion, was it? I mean, that's a complete wastage. We've seen so much wastage under this government. The fact that 3.5 million vaccines, given the vaccine inequity, are going to have to be thrown away is absolutely tragic.
Let's think about the flip side of this, though. I mean, I hate government waste. I absolutely loathe it. But if there's any time to potentially spend money that, on things that you're not going to need, it is in a pandemic. Imagine if we had run millions of vaccines short. Imagine if we can remember a time where we didn't have enough PPE. I'm much less bothered about having an oversupply of those things than I would be about having an undersupply. It's the reason that we were able to get rid of domestic restrictions in England. It's because we have vaccines. It's because we have that material. And I would also point out, I mean, everything you're talking about, the aid, it's so important, but it is also a sense of priorities, right? At some point, we have to acknowledge that the unprecedented printing and spending that we did during the pandemic has directly led to the inflation crisis we have now.
It's about the decisions that the government take. The very fact that I had a lab...
but we have to prioritise these things. We can't afford everything. So if you do want increased money on foreign aid, for example, you have to say where that's going to come from. We can't just keep printing it.
These arguments are being used before the pandemic.
Absolutely.
It's been an argument that's been running for almost a decade now.
Right, but we did an unprecedented amount of printing and spending, and now we're seeing the results of that. I mean, one cabinet minister thinks inflation is going to hit double digits. We can't simply just turn our backs at nations that we've... Certainly not. So what are we going to prioritise instead or deprioritise? Okay. That's the question.
The decisions matter. The very fact that the University of Birmingham in my constituency had a lab where they were processing testing, not for profit, right? So this is really supporting the government and it's not costing it anything. What did the government do? Shut down the lab, gave it to a private organisation within the region who then issued 40,000 incorrect results. It is those decisions where actually we know the capacity of universities, scientists, labs could have done a hell of a lot more. The government just ignored them. It actually went to the private sector and it made decisions
bad decisions during the pandemic.
But the evidence
no
is
doubt
there.
about it. We need a very serious inquiry into that. I'm just saying, pointing out to where we might be throwing away vaccines. I would say the flip side of that is, what if this country didn't have enough? And that's where I am more sympathetic.
What if we have the mutation of the virus? Because that's exactly what we are going to face. The virus will mutate if we don't vaccinate the world.
OK, well, we have gone off a bit, but Nikki, a quick thought on whether, when we come back to this idea of aid, a quick thought on whether or not we need to be doing more than we even are now.
Well, I think the government will always, when there is a situation around the world, will dip in, and if that means spending a bit more. And I take Kate's point about it's not necessarily about the 0.7 is a useful target, but that shouldn't stop doing more or doing it differently. And that's exactly what the government will do. But I mean, I don't think
people really trust the Tory government to be doing more when it comes to spending on humanitarian aid. That there is a target that's needed to be set because it seems as though
and it was a Conservative government government that set the original target.
Okay.
And I don't think you can, say that the government has not stepped in, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's other parts of the world, where there are natural disasters and everything else. The UK is a world leader in international development support. We can argue about the specifics of all of that, but you can't argue overall that the UK has not set the tone on this, for many, many years.
We do need to move on. Alita, you raised this issue about refugees and the UK's response to that growing refugee crisis that is stemming from Ukraine. And from today, people who have relatives in the UK, Ukrainians, can register online to get a visa, which is meant to try and speed up that process. And we also know a second scheme has been announced. This is the sponsorship scheme, where people in the UK, as well as charities and organisations, can offer a room for a refugee who doesn't currently have links to the UK to come here. Take a look at this headline in The Guardian. Refugee website crashes as 89,000 Britons rush to take in Ukrainians. That is that idea of people who are prepared to take Ukrainian refugees into their own homes. And it's worth saying that overnight, the number of people registering and interest in that scheme doubled. So, Alita, surely now this is a more generous offer.
Surely on paper, but also we've got issues of how this is actually going to come to fruition. We're now day 20 in this invasion. More than 2.5 million people have been fleeing their homes, seeking safety in any nearby country they can get to. We've heard from our Home Secretary, Priti Patel, on a number of occasions saying that they were going to be very generous. The Prime Minister himself also saying we're going to be generous. And it's taken them, more than a week, at least more than 2 weeks, to come up with a plan that is somewhat helpful to people who want to be with their loved ones, because it's a major change, a major shift coming from a war-torn country like Ukraine. You're fleeing in the most desperate situations. You might not even speak English. You might not speak any of the other languages of the nearby countries. You're desperate to be around people that you care for, and it's taken so much pressure and backlash for the government to only now allow people to be with their loved ones. It's just crazy to me.
Nikki, a lot of your colleagues have been exacerbated at the speed of this, and even now the process is going to be fairly bureaucratic, one assumes.
Well, watching from the outside, I mean, a Department of State, particularly like the Home Office, is a bit like a big tanker. And actually, just because at the top there's a decision taken about a new scheme or different message coming out, actually getting that to filter down. And we already know the Home Office had major problems with its asylum and immigration and refugee systems, with checking, with reassurance. Priti Patel is trying to, I suspect she's getting advice on the security implications of, allowing lots of people in without checking, but there's also the humanitarian aspect, and people want to be generous. 89,000 people, families stepping forward to offer refuge is extraordinary. But of course, what we don't want, so we've just seen, haven't we, an argument about what happens when we need lots of PPE, you get lots of PPE, then you criticise destruction of lots of PPE. What we do not want to see in a matter of, a month or several years' time is, people opened up their homes, checks weren't happened, and it all goes, horribly wrong. So you've got the Home Office is trying to balance, I think, how do you provide refuge, how do you do it speedily? And I also think that there was an expectation probably about 10 days ago that actually many people fleeing from Ukraine would want to stay pretty close to the country in the hope that the conflict would be over, the war would be over, sooner rather than later, and they're able to return home. I think the reality is now setting in that may not happen. So the UK's, this initial scheme is 6 months. People can apply to be for 3 years. I think that is a generous scheme. But it doesn't surprise me that the Home Office has taken a long time, far longer than any of us would have liked, to actually be agile and flexible in making these decisions.
Labour's called this a DIY asylum system. I mean, what would you do differently then?
Well, I think we would have gone down the emergency protection visa route. There isn't a visa really for situations like this where there's conflict, you do have to look at different kind of measures. And we know that those biometric tests and those checks would have happened in days, not weeks, in the way that, Priti Patel has suggested. So actually, we could have really processed those visas much more quickly, and we could have been clear as to, how many, the government hasn't they've made suggestions about different numbers of how many people they would expect. But, I think what's happened is the government's really been shamed by the solidarity from the British public, because actually they have been just so generous, and they have been calling for a scheme allowing and enabling people to come and join, not just their families. We've also got a situation where students that were here and people working here who may have lost their jobs or they can't pay their fees, even they don't know what's going to happen. I mean, it's very easy to extend their visas because they can't return back to Ukraine. the Home Office still hasn't even made a decision as to what it is going to do with them. So this is, you know, it's really concerning. Is this going to work? And I saw the calls from the Polish mayor saying, well, actually, neighbouring countries and others need to do much more. So are we going to have a situation, because we could have up to 4 to 5 million refugees leaving Ukraine. This isn't just this situation. What's going to happen in the forthcoming months?
Kate?
It's a scheme that's first and foremost designed to keep numbers down and puts the health and safety of the Ukrainian refugees second. If you really were putting them first, you would say anybody with a Ukrainian passport right now can get on a train to come into the UK, because that passport alone signifies that you are a refugee, right? We've all seen the videos. We know what's happening. You are a refugee. So what the rest of Europe has done, come here first, get a blanket, get food, get shelter, documentation and paperwork second. And we have decided to keep this visa scheme to limit numbers. And there are a lot of Ukrainians at the moment who have made it to, say, France, who are struggling for weeks to get a visa appointment, who are running out of the disposable cash because they're not working, trying to wait for that visa appointment to come through. They are with children, they are with their families, they're struggling. And we have not opened our arms. We are still saying, jump through all these hurdles, unlike the rest of Europe, which has said, we will look after you in your time of need. It's amazing to see the British public is ready to take these Ukrainian refugees into their homes. It's wonderful to see, but I don't think the government deserves as much credit as it would like to pat itself on the back for.
I mean, even Labour hasn't said abandon the visas, has it? It hasn't done as Kate suggested and said, come here if you've got a passport.
I think most people don't realise that actually Ukraine already had an agreement with neighbouring countries which allowed visa-free access. Of course, you could stay up to a year. They extended that to 3 years. So the biometrics is important. Of course, you need to know who's coming into the country. The thing is, you don't have to make it laborious and bureaucratic. It can be done.
Travel for free on their trains.
Well, absolutely.
If you want to go anywhere in Europe right now and you show any identification of being Ukrainian, you get free travel. Yeah. They are doing everything they can to put the humanitarian need first.
I think the issue,
and we are doing everything we can to make sure it comes secondary to keeping numbers down.
I think in order to make this work, though, we've got to make sure Birmingham City Council had £800 million cut from its budget. Our council's going to get the support and the services that they are going to need. And of course, lots of people are saying to me, if I'm on benefits, will I be penalised? What will happen to me if I take somebody on or if they leave? What's the bureaucratic process entailed in that? There's no detail on that either.
We know that councils will get £10,500 per refugee taken in their area. But Nikki, do you think this is effectively about keeping numbers down, as Kate says?
No, I don't think it's about keeping numbers down, and I wouldn't agree. And I think that there is now very much a distinction. If you have got a passport, you know, then the system has freed up, and you can obviously come to the UK, and checks and things will happen later. There is a difference, obviously, for people who don't have a passport. But I do think what it's about is, as Preet says, it's about knowing who's knowing. Cause not anymore, but it's about knowing who is coming here, and that's. I don't think we can ignore the wider. People absolutely want to give refuge and support, but I don't think we should ignore the fact that there is still many people who, I think it's important, and the Home Office, that is a big message about checking.
Just on that, sorry,
Nikki,
you say it's important about knowing who is coming here. That almost concerns me, because there are a number of ethnic minorities who are Ukrainian, trying to flee the country, desperate to flee the border, and they're being held back because of the colour of their skin. And with this Home for Ukrainian scheme, essentially we're asking British people to, look around, see who they would be naturally comfortable with having in their home for up to 3 to 6 months. And these people are not getting the support they need to even just leave this stricken country full of violence and war. What's going to happen to them now? Who is going to take these Black and Asian Ukrainian refugees?
Well, I'm assuming that's an issue very much for people on the borders and the neighbouring countries. I mean, this is the start of a huge migration in Europe that we have not seen for, over 70, 80 years, basically, and this is going to go on for a long time. But that does go back to the point about the checks and everything else. And
I think just too much weight is being taken onto the security side of things, and rightly so. That's extremely important. But equally, it's just giving the government a scapegoat to be like, do you know what, we need 6 extra months to get this into place. And we've seen it, to side note with the
I think the government's moved on for it because it's realised with biometrics you've already got the checks.
Exactly.
So actually all it is you just do need to know who's coming in, a name. You can do the checks when you get here. You're absolutely right. Most of the people coming are women and girls, and I take your point on the borders. It's deeply disturbing to see actually those ethnic minorities being treated differently, and we need those governments to be making representations so everybody is treated with dignity and humanity. I totally take take on board that point. And I think, you know, many of those African countries have been making those representations, as has India, to get, of course, all of their people out and flown back.
But it's a group effort, naturally.
Absolutely, it is.
It's a massive international effort.
Yes.
OK, we do have to move on. But we have been talking about people in the UK willing to share their homes with refugees. And, of course, the issue of housing more broadly for UK citizens is something that has been very difficult. There's been a recent BBC News investigation looking at one specific aspect of this, and this is to do with exempt housing. We can talk to the BBC journalist that was part of the team who put this investigation together, Stephanie Miskin. Thank you very much for being there, Stephanie. Can you just explain to us first, because I think a lot of people won't know, what is exempt housing?
It's a type of shared social housing which offers people support, and it often houses people with very few housing options to them and may have complex needs such as substance abuse, prison leavers, mental health issues, or they've fled domestic abuse. And they'll be housed in terraces, flats above shops, or to what me and you just looks like a shared house. And in Birmingham, we know that more than £200 per week per tenant is paid for by the Department of Work and Pensions through housing benefit, direct to the housing providers. And as part of the investigation that I've been carrying out for BBC Midlands Today and BBC News Online, I've heard in some cases it's exploiting some of the country's most vulnerable people.
What made you start looking at this issue in the first place, Stephanie?
So it's an issue that's been happening in Birmingham for a number of years, and we were hearing about antisocial behaviour spilling out onto quiet residential streets and the growth of these properties, but not from the people inside them. So over the past year, I've been speaking to people who tell me about living in a nightmare, from drug dealers taking over properties to links to organised crime. And just speaking to people who move into these properties with the hope of creating a better life for themselves, independence, with a little bit of support, and in some cases have left with drug addictions themselves. But most importantly, this series of investigations that I've been working on, it's just been hearing from real people and their experiences about what's really happening behind closed doors, not just in the West Midlands, but across the UK.
OK, Stephanie, thank you very much for explaining that to us, and thank you for being there. And I think we can hear now from some of the people that Stephanie and her colleagues have been talking to. Their identities, though, have been protected.
They're all thrown into a house and left to their own devices. They're approached by gang members, drug dealers. Having access to these houses via other tenants puts them in extremely vulnerable situations even further.
People come out of care or from dry houses, and once they come out, they live in these kind of places. The people who run these are buying houses and fancy cars, but the people who live in the houses are living in squalor.
And dry houses are for people who are recovering from substance addiction. And you can see the full investigation carried out by my colleagues there on the BBC News website if you want to take a little bit more of a look about it. Now, Preet, this is something that you have been doing a lot of work on. I mean, what is your take on this?
Well, it's not just Birmingham. There's been a pilot done by government in Hull, in Blackpool, in Bristol, because we're starting to see that this is a sector where many rogue landlords are making billions of pounds. So it's not just that you're providing housing, but you're providing care, support and supervision. There is no statutory definition as to what care, support and supervision is. In my constituency, I work very closely with my residents, with my local police, and I tell you it took over a year to close down one of these properties. I actually went inside and did a spot check. There was a code on the property was regularly given to drug dealers, to people that were exploiting vulnerable women. And of course, many of these people living in these properties are with mental health, with drug abuse. But the problem is that there's not the regulation. So we've got a cross-party campaign in Birmingham calling for regulation from government to give strengthen the regulator, to give powers to local authorities to be able to close down many of these sectors. We were the first one to close in the country. You cannot have that level of resource to be able to close all of them down. And, you know, people want to...
Some of them do good work.
Some of them are absolutely excellent. You're absolutely right. And we've got to make sure that we are balancing this out. In Birmingham, we've got some fantastic providers. But, of course, we've got lots of rogue landlords. And what's happening is that communities are paying the price because we're seeing crime and antisocial behaviour spilling into the communities. I saw it, you know, with my community, and it has not been easy to bring about the change. But, of course, you know, people want to see vulnerable people supported. In Birmingham, we've got over 20,000 units. Can you believe Birmingham City Council has only commissioned 2,000 of those. That means people are bringing in people that have no links to Birmingham, who are clearly vulnerable, whether they're through the Serco contract, whether they're ex-offenders. You know, so there's a real mixed bag. Lots of vulnerable women are being placed with ex-offenders. This is not appropriate, and we've got to tackle it.
Nikki, is this something you were particularly aware of? Is it something that needs more regulation?
Well, I wasn't aware of the term exempt housing, but when I was an MP, I think there were probably similar properties. I mean, there is always a need, as Preet says and as captured on the film, for people who have come out of care, come out of the prison system, perhaps recovering from addiction, to have that property, to be given a home, to be given support and everything else. And as you said, clearly, and I think the BBC report captured, some of those schemes are working very well and people are being successfully moved on, but clearly there are going to be some issues. So I think that the Housing Minister, when there's a debate about this in Parliament, they've got these pilots looking at the lessons. It's the right idea, and it sounds to me as if, from what Preet is saying in the film, that some of the providers need to be examined, potentially stricter regulation on who is able to set up these properties and take that money to support people.
OK, as you said, it is something that's being looked at the moment, so it is potentially something that we will return to as well. But I want to move on now, and there are some hefty bits of legislation currently working their way through the Houses of Parliament, and we're expected to see the details of another one later this week when the government will introduce its long-awaited online safety bill. Nadine Dorries, the Culture Secretary, has been writing about this today on the Conservative Home website. Take a look at the headline, how we will narrow the ground for barring harmful posts in the online safety bill. And this is a very wide-ranging bill which is effectively attempting to limit the amount of harmful content that's online and that people are subjected to. Nikki, this is something you've been waiting for an awful long time. Are you feeling confident about what's going to come on Thursday?
Well, I'm really pleased to see that the step, I'm sorry, it has not been published quite today as we had expected, but it is definitely coming. When I was Culture Secretary, for a short period of time, my main role was to keep the process, the consultation moving forward. I recommended that Ofcom should be the regulator. I think this is just a phenomenally important step for the UK to be taking. This is a whole sector, the social media platforms, the search engines, where undoubtedly there can be a force for good, but there is also, so we just saw earlier on Tulip Sadiq tweeting, for example, about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. I mean, that's where social media is very powerful. But equally, we see lots of harmful content. We see young women, for example, encouraged to self-harm. We see, abuse of people in public life and worse. And so I think it's really, I just think it's great that the UK has taken a step to regulate, but it's a complicated bill. It's going to take up a lot of parliamentary time. And I'm afraid there is still going to be quite a lot of scope for amendments.
One thing that you're particularly interested in is the idea of online anonymity and whether people should be allowed to be anonymous online.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult judgment call because, again, there can be some jurisdictions where actually brave people protesting, actually an anonymous account does protect. But I do think the platforms need to be asking further questions. I think they should have more details about who is opening the accounts, whether that could be linked to a credit card, whether that's to an IP address. So when there is a problem with a post or a series of posts, they know where to go. The other issue is going to be about directors' liability. At the moment, there isn't sufficient liability for senior management, and I think that's going to be a really live area for debate.
OK, Kate, just on this point of online anonymity, do you think that's right, that people should have to provide their genuine identity to the providers, to the platforms at least?
I think if you are truly afraid for your safety, if you are somebody who is protesting, if you're somebody who's a whistleblower, even handing over credit card details is going to put you off from doing so and giving us the information that we would otherwise get from you to make this world a better place. Countries that have mandated that, in places like South Korea, have seen hackers just go to town and they do manage to get these details. If you can't have real anonymity, then you are always going to be under threat of being exposed. There are trade-offs here. It is the fundamental trade-off between security and liberty. I fall on the side of liberty. I will wait to see the full bill, but I am deeply worried that this concoction between big tech and government is only going to lead to limiting our freedom of speech. This idea that things that are legal and yet harmful, which are going to be removed, taken out of public discourse, should be very worrying for anybody who believes in free speech.
Where does Labour sit on this issue of online anonymity? Your colleague Margaret Hodge says, I want social media companies like Facebook and Twitter to be able to identify everybody who has an account and uses their platforms.
I think that's absolutely right. But, of course, that recognises that there will be some activists in some parts of the world that do need to have that anonymity. But as long as the social media companies are aware that it is a real person, not the bots that we are seeing and being used politically in the way way that we are. I think the biggest
Why
issue,
wouldn't they
though,
be here in the UK?
I think the biggest issue, though, for us is that you can't allow social media companies to decide what's, what to regulate and what's harmful. And I think that's been the big issue, because there are so many people, whether it's women, misogyny, whether it's young people, that this doesn't sort of take into account. I think child protection safeguarding, especially as a parent, I'm talking as a mother, is something that I'm really worried about. I don't think this bill actually goes far enough, and I want to see much more protections. But yeah, of course, but I've had to block 700 accounts. I've had to report to Twitter what I think constitutes as harmful, and I'm then told that actually it's not. I mean, I think there's got to be also a regulator where people can make a complaint. At the moment, people feel very powerless because they feel that they can be treated as and how, social media companies are allowing people to use their platforms, and actually women are bearing the brunt of that, I think.
I suspect that every single one of us around this table, to varying degrees as well, has experienced some pretty horrible online abuse. There's nothing nice about it. There's no defense of the people who send that. I think the onus is then even more on us to talk about that very difficult balance we have to strike, that something can be harmful and hurtful and rude and disgusting and should have no place in public life. It doesn't always mean it's illegal. Now, if it is illegal, if we're talking about death threats, if we're talking about inciting violence, thankfully in this country we have laws to deal with that.
Of course, not if people are anonymised.
But if we're
how do the police follow it up?
But you can report those things to the police. It is considered to be illegal, and you can get the top minds in the country ideally on that. What you cannot do is start chipping away at even the most disgusting forms of freedom of speech because we find it harmful and we don't like it. It's horrible, but you can't chip away at those fundamental rights.
We must remember that, female confidence in the police is at an all-time low at the moment, given a number of cases that we've seen. I only need to mention the name Sarah Everard, and, everyone around the room is just sort of nodding away. But it's not always easy for women to come forward and report crimes that may be seen as not so important, or, they may be exaggerating things or taking things the wrong way. And that's often what I've heard when speaking to a number of women who've come forward to share their stories. They're not taken seriously, essentially. I mean, women aren't taken seriously when they even report issues like domestic abuse and sexual abuse, let alone getting a tweet that you found extremely harmful and offensive. So we need to draw some sort of line.
I couldn't agree with you more, but I couldn't agree with you more. And that's a problem with our institutions and our systems that very often don't take women seriously. That can be in the hospital when it comes to pain. It can be in the police.
That accountability
within the police. But then why on earth, given the fact that we don't have this kind of belief in it, would you actually want to empower those institutions to decide over you as the individual what is harmful and what they're going to process?
I want to get Nikki's thoughts on the idea of limiting free speech and the danger of an anonymity online being a requirement doing that.
Well, I don't think, as I say, I think there are some brave campaigns about anonymity in certain jurisdictions. There is an argument for that. But I think what this bill is more about is asking the platforms to live up to the terms and conditions that they set. If we say now, and actually sometimes what is harmful offline in the so-called real world is not illegal or deemed to be harmful online. And, the power of social media, why would we allow this online platforms now to have such influence and reach and not ask them to follow the same rules that they would if they were organising something, offline? And so this is about behaviour. It's about asking the companies to live up to the terms and conditions that they say that they are setting, so that when people do make a complaint or the police want to investigate something, those platforms cooperate and give over information in order to bring a successful prosecution. And that's what is not always happening.
All of this highlights the deep flaws in big tech, in the police, in our institutions, but none of this solves the problem. You cannot solve the problem by making it easier to prosecute people who haven't actually broken the law. That is dangerous for every single individual, including ourselves. I mean,
but that's not what the bill is seeking to do. The
Big Brother Watch did a fantastic.
There is no regulation. There is no regulation of these platforms at the moment. It's not a question of saying actually how far the regulation. That will be part of the debate, but there isn't any regulation.
Big Brother Watch did a fantastic. I don't even know what you call it. Maybe a promo looking at some of the tweets of MPs showing how they will be flagged. They will be taken offline. Elected representatives because they are legal but harmful. This is a threat to every individual, and there's serious issues here, right? I don't doubt that, but I don't think we've come up with the solution.
We will be debated in Parliament.
We will be debated in Parliament. We'll see the details of that bill when they are published on Thursday. As I say, long-awaited and seemingly quite contentious, but I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. Joe will be back tomorrow at 11:15, but from us, goodbye.